You know, when people think of prog rock in the 80s, they usually think of bands like Rush or King Crimson or Marillion or Genesis or sometimes Yes. But there's one band that's almost always overlooked when you think of progressive music in the 80s, even though they embodied the very spirit of what prog music's supposed to be. They weren't labeled prog rock, and they certainly didn't sound like classic prog rock from the 70s, but they consistently pushed rock music into a new territory, and they became one of the biggest bands in the world. And I'm talking about the Police. That might sound strange to you, but hear me out. If prog rock or progressive rock is about advancing the music instead of simply just writing long songs with odd time signatures and all that, the Police certainly should be counted among that. They blended punk, jazz, reggae, world music, new wave. They had a sophisticated songwriting. Sting wrote a lot about philosophical or literary issues in literary terms. You had Stuart Copeland, you had Andy Summers, you had Sting. These were great musicians. They weren't your standard musicians. You know, they used a lot of jazz flavors, a lot of suspended chords, a lot of atmospheric effects and things like that. I mean, you just listen to Ghost in the Machine, listen to Synchronicity, songs like Synchronicity 1, Walking in Your Footsteps, Spirits in the Material World, Secret Journey, Murder by Numbers, Tea in the Sahara. These weren't just like catchy songs. They were experimental and musically complex, and they reached a mainstream audience. And then there's my favorite, Wrapped Around Your Finger, which became a major hit despite being written in a 6/8 meter. It had literary imagery, you know, the Scylla and Charybdis. It mentioned Nabokov. You know, it had these subtle dynamics in it, and it had this atmosphere to it. Even the video, you know. But what really separates the Police from these traditional progressive rock bands, besides the sound itself, but they rarely use like odd time signatures. That was one song where they did. Wrapped Around Your Finger, they did use, like I said, a 6/8 time signature. But instead, they usually made ordinary 4/4 feel different or feel extraordinary. Like Copeland consistently played against the beat through the syncopation. You know, Sting's bass lines usually floated sort of independently through the movement. And then you had Andy Summers. He had like this jazz harmony over like reggae grooves and a sort of a punk sound and at times ambient music coming in. The result of all that was that their music, it sounded like it was changing the meter sometimes, even when it wasn't. I mean, that's incredible. That's incredible. Sort of accomplishment, of an achievement. When you're able to make it sound that way, even though you may not be doing it that way, I mean, that's just an incredible achievement. So to me, you know, it's like, even though you're not having a complex 20-minute epic, you are still, the Police still, displayed this technicality with their music. And they hid that complexity inside these concise sort of songs. And, you know, millions of people loved them. And that's harder than most people realize. It's what I've said before about when you can take complexity and you can mix it with mainstream appeal, then you've done something magical. And I think the Police did that. That's why all of their albums are like, they had hits on every album, and every album was still complex. You know, the Police were actually one of the most progressive bands in the 1980s. So were they the most? Probably not, even though I said that in the title. King Crimson produced some of the, more complex music, and Rush certainly had an extraordinary run in the 80s, but that's really not the point. The Police absolutely belong in this conversation. And I'd argue that they are one of the three most progressive bands of the decade, along with King Crimson and Rush. And then you could throw Marillion in there as well. But they're almost never mentioned when people discuss progressive music, because people always define prog, to mean long songs and odd meters and technical virtuosity. But, to me, it's not necessarily all that. Progressive music isn't necessarily defined by that. It's defined by the innovation and about expanding what rock music can be. And if that's the definition, then the Police were definitely part of that in the 80s for sure. So, what does progressive mean? And that's actually what I'm going to explore in the next video that I make. But I hope you enjoyed this. Tell me what you think about the Police in the 1980s. Please like the video, share it, subscribe to my channel, and there'll be more great videos on the way. And until next time, you guys take care.